Welcome everyone to today's webinar. My name is Nishima Chudasama. I'm the Director of Programs at Nest Foundation. We are a 501c3 nonprofit headquartered in Los Angeles, but working around the country. We primarily work to prevent sexual violence, exploitation, and trafficking among young people. We do this by creating prevention education resources, including curricula for young people, teacher trainings, counselor trainings, as well as parent workshops and opportunities for student leadership. If you'd like to learn more about what we do, you can visit our website at nestfoundation.org. Obviously, right now in the midst of this pandemic, we are experiencing tremendous stress. We're seeing our students and their families trying to cope with uncertain situations, and all of you are in your own work doing what you can to support them from a distance. So today's webinar will hopefully share some new information or reinforce some of what you already know. And I do want to let you know that we've been really grateful to get insights from you as you registered, and we've collected a lot of the information that you're interested in learning about, and we'll be hosting a summer series of special topic webinars. We'll be able to dive deep either through forums and conversation settings or through webinars like this to really go deeper in some of those topic areas. For today, Corianna Sichel will be leading our session to talk about in kind of broad overview ways how you all can support young people. I do want to invite questions using the chat box at the bottom. As Corianna wraps up the presentation section, I'll be able to kind of call out your questions. You can also share resources with each other on similar webinars. We've had learned about some fantastic new resources that we didn't know about. And finally, we will have a recording of a version of our webinar, as well as the PowerPoint available to you, which I will email out in a couple of days following this session today. So with that, thank you again for all you do. I'm going to turn it over to Corianna. I'll be here. If you have questions on the chat, please do send them in, and I'll be back at the end.
Hi, thank you, Nishima. So as Nishima mentioned, let me get my bearings here. As Nishima mentioned, my name is Corianna Sichel, and I am a fellow in the Yale School of Medicine, Department of Psychiatry, Division of Prevention and Community Research. I also just received my PhD this spring from NYU Steinhardt School of Culture, Education, and Human Development, where I've been studying counseling psychology. I've been working with Nest for a number of years as a curriculum and evaluation consultant, and I'm really glad to be able to be here with all of you today. I want to take a moment to thank the incredible teachers and researchers across the country whose work and wisdom made this presentation possible. When Nest asked me to put something together to support educators during COVID, these individuals were extremely generous with their time and experience in consulting on the materials that I'll be presenting today. So many thanks to all of them. I want to start out by thanking all of you for your thoughtful questions and concerns that you sent in with your registrations. Given our time limitations, I won't be able to address each and every issue that you all raised. So I ask that you please feel free to bring things up in our discussion afterwards, as Nishima mentioned. There's also going to be a survey link available after this Zoom is completed, and I really hope that you'll take a moment to complete it. There are 6 survey questions, so it's not very long, and it'll give you an opportunity to share suggestions and request additional information, and it's really super helpful. So please do take a couple moments to just complete that at the end of the webinar. Today, our objectives are threefold. First, we're going to talk about child sexual and physical abuse during the pandemic. Next, we'll discuss some strategies for preventing, detecting, and responding to possible risk. And then finally, we'll spend some time on self-care and compassion fatigue. So as mandated reporters, teachers and other professionals, including doctors, school nurses, counselors, psychologists, and other school personnel, are legally required to report any suspicion of child abuse or neglect to the authorities. The definitions here are a minimum standard set by the federal government. And every state has their own additional definitions. But broadly, child abuse is anything that actively harms a child or puts children in imminent risk of harm. Not acting to protect kids can also put them at risk and can also be considered child abuse. The signs of child abuse and neglect during a pandemic are the same as they were before the pandemic. They include withdrawal, changes in behavior, depression, running away, unexplained injuries, decreases in school performance, maybe noticed in kids who were previously doing pretty well, and also developmental regression, particularly in younger kiddos. So these things are all the same as they were before the pandemic, but the problem is that we aren't there physically with kids to see some of these signs that we might normally pick up on. New federal child abuse and neglect data released in January 2020, so before the pandemic really took hold here in the States, showed an increase in the number of victims who suffered maltreatment for the first time since 2015. So we wanted to just take a minute and talk about child abuse by the numbers. But the only thing we know for sure about estimates of child abuse is that they, with a very high degree of likelihood, underrepresent actual rates. But this is what the most recent data from the Administration for Children and Families here in the States showed. So 5 children die each year related to child abuse. Estimates are that 3.4 million reports of child abuse or neglect are made annually. And we know from all of the media reporting right now that those numbers are way down during the pandemic. In normal times, when those 3 to 4 million reports of abuse are made, 20% are substantiated, which means that 600,000 to 800,000 reports are substantiated every year. And more than 15% of victims experienced 2 or more types of maltreatment. So we have a lot of kids who aren't just experiencing one form of child abuse or neglect, but actually are victims to multiple different types of abuse. The majority of substantiated reports were for neglect, followed by physical and sexual abuse. Sexual abuse in particular is likely to be underreported. However, we know that kids are regularly being victimized both in person and online, and many of the perpetrators of that abuse are actually people who kids know, not strangers, who they suddenly meet on the street. And what that means is that a lot of kids who are victims of child sexual abuse might actually be cooped up with their abusers during the pandemic. Additionally, we know that kids are being victimized online, and that represents a relatively new arena for child abuse and child sexual abuse. So research suggests that approximately 1 in 5 kids will be sexually abused by the time they are 18. So in a class of 30, that's 6 kids, which is a lot. And again, all signs point to this being underreported. So in terms of the unwanted sexual solicitations that kids might also receive online, those can be coming from a variety of different sources. And while all of that's happening, the internet is also awash in pictures and videos depicting child sexual abuse. So there are just many different avenues through which child sexual abuse happens, both online and in person. In the face of COVID-19, all of this is likely getting worse. We're all dealing with stress, and humans manifest stress in psychological, emotional, cognitive, physiological, and behavioral ways. And statistics that are coming out every day illustrate how COVID is exacerbating the existing inequalities along racial, ethnic, socioeconomic, and other lines. That means that our most vulnerable members of society are now even more so. Social distancing means that students and families no longer get the social and material support that schools provide, including access to material resources and interactions with teachers and peers. For students and families, this can mean that situations which were tenuous before become worse. It also means that families who were previously doing all right are now at greater risk. Parents may be out of work and families are cooped up together in small spaces. Research and common sense suggest that increases in stress may lead to increases in rates of abuse. And given possible financial hardship, there may also be increases in rates of neglect during the pandemic. As I mentioned before, for kids who are being sexually abused, social distancing means and quarantine means that many are now trapped at home with their abusers. And increased reliance on online communication modalities mean that kids are more likely to be exposed to phishing, exploitation, misinformation, and explicit and violent content online. Overall, all of this means a lot of risk for our students and their families. So now we're going to talk a little bit about strategies for preventing, detecting, and responding to possible risk. As a researcher, I think about 3 different tiers of intervention. Tier 1 or universal interventions are for all students. These are interventions focused on prevention, cultivating resilience, and healthy coping. Tier 2 or selective interventions target kids at risk. We suspect there might be a problem there, or perhaps one is developing, but maybe it's not confirmed. And then Tier 3 or indicated interventions are used when we know for a fact there's a problem. So when we think about preventing, detecting, and responding to possible risk during the pandemic, this tiered approach can be really helpful. And I'll come back to it in a couple of minutes. No matter if you're using universal, selective, indicated, or a strategy that might kind of bridge levels to prevent and respond to possible risk, you want to do this work and come to it from a position of being an advocate. So what is an advocate? Well, the dictionary defines an advocate or advocacy as the act or process of supporting a cause. So an advocate is a person who supports other people. And during the pandemic, and in particular during this webinar, we're really focused on advocating for vulnerable children and their families. The fact that you signed up for this workshop and are taking time out of your busy lives to participate suggests to me that you are already probably working as an advocate for your students and their families. So this is just a reminder. Advocacy starts from a place of empathy. So we're going to watch a really quick, nice little clip from Brene Brown about empathy. And you'll have to bear with me juggling Zoom and YouTube, and hopefully this will be smooth.
So what is empathy, and why is it very different than sympathy? Empathy fuels connection. Sympathy drives disconnection. Empathy, it's very interesting. Teresa Wiseman is a nursing scholar who studied professions, very diverse professions where empathy is relevant, and came up with 4 qualities of empathy. Perspective taking, the ability to take the perspective of another person or recognize their perspective as their truth. Staying out of judgment, not easy when you enjoy it as much as most of us do. Recognizing emotion in other people and then communicating that. Empathy is feeling with people. And to me, I always think of empathy as this kind of sacred space when someone's kind of in a deep hole and they shout out from the bottom and they say, I'm stuck, it's dark, I'm overwhelmed. And then we look and we say, hey, I'm down. I know what it's like down here, and you're not alone. Sympathy is, ooh, it's bad, no, you want a sandwich? Empathy is a choice, and it's a vulnerable choice, because in order to connect with you, I have to connect with something in myself that knows that feeling. Rarely, if ever, does an empathic response begin with at least. I had it, yeah. And we do it all the time, because you know what? Someone just shared something with us that's incredibly painful, and we're trying to silver lining it. I don't think that's a verb, but I'm using it as one. We're trying to put the silver lining around it. So I had a miscarriage. At least you know you can get pregnant. I think my marriage is falling apart. At least you have a marriage. John's getting kicked out of school. At least Sarah is an A student. But one of the things we do sometimes in the face of very difficult conversations is we try to make things better. If I share something with you that's very difficult, I'd rather you say, I don't even know what to say right now. I'm just so glad you told me. Because the truth is, rarely can a response make something better. What makes something better is connection.
All right. So what does it mean to be authentic? What does it mean to be an advocate? I'm looking at my next talking point. Being an advocate means being authentic. I think right now in this time of e-learning and Zoom communications, everything can feel different and strange. And we can feel like we need to reinvent all of the wheels. But really, I want to remind you that the same things that you've done before to build rapport, you can keep on doing. It just might be delivered in a different through a different mechanism. It's really important always to come from a place of authenticity, because kids know, kids of all ages can pick up on authenticity and inauthenticity. And being an advocate right now is really important because given the limitations of e-learning and social distancing during the pandemic, a lot of the ways that we used to find out about abuse aren't going to work, right? We can't necessarily always see a kid's black eye or notice that a kid seems more withdrawn. So student report is a really important way for us to find out about abuse and be able to step in to support children during the pandemic. But for kids to feel like they can disclose and report potential abuse, they need to be able to trust. And being an advocate means letting students know that they can trust you, not just by saying it, but by really demonstrating it through interactions and outreach. So a second element of being an advocate is validation. And from the psychotherapy literature, we know how important validation is. It lets people know that they've been heard. We validate challenges. And by doing that, we promote connection. We let other people know that what they're going through is hard and it's understandable that they're having a hard time. And validation doesn't necessarily mean you're agreeing with someone. It just means that you're hearing them. So that's really important to remember. Just saying like, wow, I hear that you're having a really hard time right now. That doesn't say that, you think that they should be having a hard time or they shouldn't be having a hard time or their concern is valid or invalid. It's just really, I hear you, and that sounds really rough. Being an advocate also means offering tools, resources, and information, but not answers. I think that it's really natural to want to solve things for other people, but part of advocacy means that we're supporting, we're not necessarily fixing. Which goes right into the next element of advocacy, which is about helping to problem solve. We want to support families and children in solving their own problems. And this actually is also really important for building a sense of self-efficacy. And self-efficacy, we know from the research literature, can be linked to resilience. So once you have a sense that you are someone who is capable, who can solve problems, maybe not only by yourself, maybe with some support and some help from an advocate, but that you can do that yourself, you're not helpless, that will give you a sense that you can bounce back from things in the future. And that's really where we see resiliency developing. And this is particularly important during the pandemic because, as this kind of drags on, we are approaching at some point a shift. States are starting to reopen. There will be life after COVID-19, or at least after this quarantine. And so we want to be thinking about how we can prepare our students and our families to transition into whatever comes next with as much strength as they possibly can. Next, it's really important, especially right now, to be flexible and sensitive. Our students can come from all different types of families and cultural backgrounds, and different communities have different understandings of perhaps safety or appropriate practices. And so being an advocate means that we are sensitive and flexible, given all of those things. It can feel really comforting, I think, to kind of be rigid sometimes, to say, no, there's a right way and there's a wrong way, and we're going to do the right way. But being an advocate is about being able to sit with that middle space and say, okay, I'm going to listen to you, hear what you're saying, and then I'm going to help you from there. And last but not least, being an advocate means being accountable. And being accountable is just simply keeping your word. So if you tell a student, hey, I'm going to follow up with you about this tomorrow, being accountable means that you follow up with them. Maybe you promise them a resource and you can't deliver. That's okay. We're all human. Then being accountable is about saying, hey, I know I said I was going to follow up with you today about that resource. I haven't been able to find it yet, but I'm working on it, and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. You'll definitely hear from me by 2 o'clock on Tuesday, no matter what. And so giving students and families timelines and letting them know, I'm going to do this thing by this time, it can be really helpful because it lets them know they don't need to worry. And we're there, we're going to come through for them, and they can trust us. So I want to just draw your attention to this really lovely resource from the National Child Traumatic Stress Network. There's a link to it on the NEST resources page, which I'll be sharing a link to at the end of the presentation. And this talks about typical kind of signs of stress during the COVID pandemic that we might be seeing in school-aged and adolescent children and youth. And it also provides some suggestions around ways to support them through this difficult time. And it's a really great resource. Another resource that I also want to highlight that's linked to on the NEST website is COVID Coach. It's actually an app from the VA, and they have some just incredible links to all different types of resources, both at the national and community level that connect people into assessments about stress, tips for wellness, and it's just a really great resource with a ton of information that I think is really appropriate for everyone. It's got a ton of information in there also for families, so that can be a nice thing to suggest. And these types of interventions, these types of information, they're really about what we would call the prevention, so the tier 1 on our tiered intervention model. These are things that are helpful for everyone, I think, during these times. I found them helpful in my own life. So, getting back to those tiers, when we think about tier 1, it's really about prevention. And prevention is about prioritizing safety and support. We want to wrap around students and their families during this time. And remember that the vast majority of teachers and counselors and nurses and families want the same thing. We want our kids to thrive. So there are 4 kind of domains that are really important as we're thinking about prevention during the pandemic. And the first is to teach about healthy coping. So just letting kids know, like, yeah, it can be really stressful. Here are some specific techniques that you can use when you're feeling stressful. Exercise can be helpful. Healthy routines, eating a balanced diet, getting enough sleep. I know with many of my child and adolescent clients right now, their sleep schedules are completely off. Teaching kids about breathing exercises, and some of those things that we might not think of as being necessarily content that's covered in school. It's really important right now to be sure to emphasize these things to kids so that they know that there are some options, some things that they can try that are healthy as they're coping with stress during the pandemic. We also really want to provide information, especially about online risk and safety during this time. As I said, given our reliance on the internet and various platforms for communication and teaching and just everything right now, kids are at additional risk, and they may not know the kind of signs of risk and also how to keep themselves safe. During the pandemic, it's also likely that kids are having additional unsupervised internet time, which just adds another problematic layer. The NEST curriculum, I know, does do this sort of information provision about online risk and safety. And there are many ways, that we can get this information to kids. I know the NEST curriculum does so through digital citizenship, talking about risk, and also critical analysis of media content. So we don't necessarily only want to scare kids. We want to really engage them, or we don't want to scare them, period. We want to engage them in thinking critically about kind of what they're doing online and the possible ramifications. And that discussion can be more than just about, you need to watch out for people who may have bad intent. It can also be about thinking about, what are they really doing when they're online? What kind of content are they engaging with? And what does that content say about society and about them and about where we all are today? The third thing that's super important right now is to support kids in supporting each other. It's likely that students know more about what's going on with each other than we as adults might. And so we need to provide students bystander trainings to let them know the risk signs, what to look for in other youth, and also what they can do if they are concerned about a peer. So resources and ways that they can get help. And there are, a number of great programs out there that offer training in bystander interventions for kids. The NEST curriculum does this as well. And it's just a really important thing, especially during these times. And it also is a way of empowering kids. I think it feels really good for kids when they know that they can help keep their peers safe. Last but not least, we want to create opportunities to cultivate resilience. The research literature suggests that resilience is something that all of us can have. It's not like a gene where some people have it and some people don't. And ways to do this include through social connection, cultivating experiences of agency, as I mentioned earlier, and also creativity. So giving kids opportunities to feel that they are doing things that they can have an impact on their world, and allowing them to express themselves. So now we're going to move into tier 2. And just as a reminder, tier 2, these are things that we might be thinking about when, there's potentially risk or likely some risk going on. And so it's really about detection and identifying risk. And the first thing I want to just remind everyone about is, trusting your intuition and your experience. As educators, you are experts in kids. And, right now, everything can feel really different, but they're still the same kids on the other side of that computer screen. And it's just really important to listen to, that voice inside of each of us that kind of knows when maybe something is off. And, you know, your experience from classroom teaching, right, has perfectly equipped you to do that during the pandemic, even though at the time you were, you know, being trained and all the years that you may have been teaching. I doubt that this was something that you knew you were preparing for. So just a few kind of really concrete things to do. It's important to know the signs of child abuse and neglect. I listed some earlier. There are also some resources on the NEST resource page that offer additional information about potential signs. And as I said before, it's important to provide information. We want to provide information to students about what physical abuse and neglect are, so that they know, like, oh, maybe something is happening that shouldn't be. A lot of disclosures will happen during normal times in schools when there's programming on child abuse and neglect, and kids realize, oh, wow, you know, that thing that I felt kind of funny about that was happening, it really isn't okay. And now I know someone who I can tell about it. And that's how we find out about a lot of abuse and neglect during normal times. It's so important right now to check in on students, letting them know that you care and are there and you're thinking about them, asking them how they're doing, and really providing opportunities for one-on-one outreach. I know that there are some districts where that can be really challenging, where there may be limitations on how you engage individually with students, but it's so important right now. Especially if you have, you know, relationships with specific students. I know some schools are kind of dividing, you know, the student body up and assigning 20 students per teacher. And while that's a really great way to make sure that everyone's getting outreach, kids might be less likely to respond to a teacher who they don't know. So it's really important to use those connections that you've been building all year. This isn't September, it's May, so you know your kids already. And just reaching out and saying, hey, I'm just wondering how you're doing. Asking them that question is really important. Not just saying like, hey, thinking about you, but really checking in about how they're doing, how their families are doing, and kind of how they're coping during this time. We also really want to be strategic. So on a video call, we want kids as much as possible to sit with their backs to the room so that we can see into the home and see what it's looking like. When that happens, we have an opportunity to look out for, you know, possible indications that maybe things aren't going so well. You know, does the house look very disheveled? Are there signs of increased frustration? You know, when you're seeing interactions between children and other people in their homes, or maybe you're observing some interactions just between adults in the home. And it's also really important to pay attention to student assignments. So, you know, thinking about, okay, our students can't talk to us necessarily in the ways that they did before. How are they talking to us now? I spoke to some teachers and some district level administrators who said they're finding out about abuse just based on what kids are writing in their homework and then following up. Just like we want students to have their backs to the room so that we can see into the home most of the time, it can also be really important to have kids' backs be to a wall at other times, as I'm sitting right now. When we started thinking about adapting the NEST curriculum for use during the pandemic, one of the things we were really concerned about was, okay, these kids, we don't know what's happening in their homes, and we don't want them to have potentially sensitive material being, you know, on their screens when we're not sure who's in the environment, and that could potentially put them at additional risk for abuse. And, you know, if, for example, if a perpetrator saw that they were, you know, getting resources about calling a hotline or something like that, and thought like, oh, they're going to act against me, and then maybe the abuse escalates or something somehow changes and worsens. So in situations like that, we want kids sitting with their backs to a wall. We also want kids to use headphones so that they can control, really who's hearing the content that we're giving them. And also using chat functions can be a really great way to allow kids to participate while maybe being respectful that they might not be in a safe, or being aware that they might not be in a safe position in their homes. So since we aren't seeing kids in person, disclosures, as I mentioned before, are a really important way of learning about potential abuse and neglect. And no two disclosures are the same. So we wanted to take you through 4 different types of disclosures that you might encounter. The first one is a purposeful disclosure. Purposeful disclosures mean that kids have had a chance to really think about what's going on. They know it's not okay. They're ready to take action and maybe take some control back in their situation. And they reach out to tell someone so that the abuse stops. And they're really ready. They've thought about this moment and they're prepared. Prompted disclosures are what happens when we call kids up for a check-in and say, hey, I was just wondering, how things are in your house. Is everything okay? How are you feeling? So a prompted disclosure is when someone asks if someone has experienced abuse, or maybe asks just an open-ended question, and the story comes out. Prompted disclosures also happen, right? That's the type of disclosure that I referred to when we provide kids with education about child abuse, physical, sexual, or neglect, and they're prompted. Okay, that thing is happening to me and they're telling me that it's not okay. I'm going to tell someone about it. So those are all examples of prompted disclosures. Accidental disclosures happen when someone walks in on the abuse, when the child maybe isn't expecting or really realizing that the disclosure is now happening. Maybe it's something we see on a webcam. In previous times, maybe it was we catch kids doing something. And the important thing to realize about accidental disclosures are that kids aren't ready to talk about the abuse in these cases. They haven't prepared themselves. They don't really realize what's going on. And all of a sudden, the news is out. And so it's really important to be sensitive in instances of accidental disclosure. And piecemeal disclosure can kind of be similar to accidental disclosure. It's when kids are sort of dropping us breadcrumbs, and maybe they sort of want us to know what's going on, but they sort of don't want us to know what's going on. Timelines may not quite fit, and things just aren't adding up, but there's clearly something there, and that needs to be followed up on. So the main point really across all of these different types of disclosures is, of course, that there's no one type of disclosure that we always see. Not all disclosures will be the same, and you might have a disclosure that catches you off guard. You might put together bits of piecemeal information and realize that you need to report. And it's also important to realize that some kids may never disclose. And, I think that 20% on that slide earlier that I showed, that 20% of reports were substantiated. That doesn't mean that abuse was only happening in 20% of cases. In fact, I would imagine that the percent of cases in which abuse was actually happening was probably higher. But sometimes kids don't disclose for whatever reason. And just because a report might not be substantiated, that does not mean that it shouldn't be made, especially right now when kids are particularly vulnerable. So responding to disclosures, this can be a balancing act between your responsibility to report as a mandated reporter and the potential needs of the child who has disclosed. During the disclosure and follow-up process, it's really important that we validate and support students. So we want to say, oh, I'm so sorry that happened to you. That sounds really difficult. I'm so glad that you told me. You're so brave for telling me. We're going to go get you some help so this doesn't happen anymore. I'm going to make sure you stay safe. And really giving them that kind of warm reception lets them know that we're there for them. We're taking it seriously. We have their interests at heart, and it's going to be, better, and there's some hope. During the disclosure and follow-up process, it's really important to give students options to support them in feeling a sense of control and, again, agency. And of course, we're not going to give them a choice between, are we going to report this or not report this? It has to be reported. But there are other ways that we can offer students choices. So for example, hey, you seem really upset. Do you want to do a breathing exercise to calm down? Or do you want to go get a drink of water? I'm going to follow up with you in a couple of hours. Do you want me to call you or text you? And those little choices, they might not seem very important or big, but they're really critical in allowing kids to regain a sense of control. Likely after, making a report, kids are feeling extremely vulnerable and scared. So it's just letting them know they still have some control in the situation, and kind of bringing them back and giving them an opportunity to center into that. And last but not least, it's critical to be transparent with children and families as we go through the disclosure process and the reporting process. And this is because, as the call is being made, families and children can feel really scared. And we want them to know, we want to give them as much information as possible so that they know what to expect. And so that they know that they can trust us. The last thing we want to have happen is that a child or a family has a terrible experience in the context of a report, and then they don't disclose future abuse or they don't reach out for help in the future. I think it's not easy to tell someone that you're going to be making a call, but that's okay. I know I've sat with parents, had parents in the room while I've made calls, and just letting them, know this is what's going to happen. Do you want to be with me while I call DCF? Sometimes on you, or would you rather, me call you afterwards and let you know how it goes? That's really important in continuing to cultivate that relationship with parents and also with children, especially during these times. So being an advocate during this pandemic can mean that you are suddenly getting a lot more information about your students than you had before. You might be glimpsing into their homes, for example, seeing things that might be hard, and that can be a lot. So self-care is extremely important. Being an advocate for others also means that you need to take care of yourself. And so that's what we're going to talk about next. I love this quote from Audre Lorde. It says, "I have come to believe that caring for myself is not self-indulgent. Caring for myself is an act of survival." And I think right now that is particularly true. You aren't only people's teachers or school counselors or administrators. Many of you are also caregivers yourselves, perhaps homeschooling your own little ones, caring for elderly relatives, other family members, pets. And in order to help others, we need to make sure that, we are putting our own oxygen masks on first. So secondary traumatic stress is what happens to us when we hear about terrible things happening to other people. And it's a really important distinction, because I think sometimes we can wonder, why am I feeling so terrible? This bad thing didn't happen to me. But secondary traumatic stress is really real. And when we combine secondary traumatic stress with primary traumatic stress, So stress related to bad things that are happening to us. For example, stress, that we might personally be experiencing during the pandemic. When we combine that with knowing that perhaps members of our community or our students are having a hard time and there's bad things happening to them, we're hearing about abuse, or we're afraid that we're not catching abuse that might be happening, all of that can lead to compassion fatigue. And compassion fatigue is really the opposite of something called compassion satisfaction. Compassion satisfaction is the pleasure we get from being able to do our work as educators, as caregivers. And when compassion fatigue takes hold, we might feel exhausted, frustrated, depressed, and that in turn can lead to burnout. Burnout is something that a lot of us kind of have an intuitive idea about, but from the research perspective, burnout is associated with feelings of hopelessness and difficulties in dealing with work or feeling that we're doing our jobs effectively. It can have a really gradual onset. So all of a sudden you're noticing that you're just dreading, Monday morning, for example. And these negative feelings can reflect the sense that we can't make a difference. So we're feeling completely powerless, and that can really kind of come out in these feelings of burnout. I really love this graphic. It's from the Compassion and Resilience Toolkit, which is also linked to on the NEST resources page. And it has some great resources for educators, schools, and families. And it's just a kind of cute depiction, if you like cats, of kind of how burnout comes about. So we might start out as zealots out to save the world, but after a little bit, we are likely to find ourselves becoming increasingly irritable, withdrawing, potentially withdrawing from those who maybe give us joy or who we're connected to otherwise. And then we enter the zombie phase when everything feels overwhelming and too much. And even though we've already withdrawn, it just doesn't feel like we can kind of continue. And then there's a fork in the road, and either we refuel and practice compassion resilience, or we leave the professions that we're in because it's just too much and it's not sustainable. So I'm going to take you through a very quick self-care assessment, and I'm going to go through it at a relatively fast pace, but I encourage you to come back to this and think about it going forward. And just a reminder that self-care, when we think about self-care can be things that we do with our bodies, exercise, for example, our minds, crossword puzzles, other things like that, brain teasers. Self-care can be spiritual. So engaging in religious practices or with religious communities or spiritual communities, can also be emotional. Talking to a loved one, someone who we find comforting, or reminding ourselves of a comforting time. Self-care can also be, letting ourselves have a good cry. Intellectual, I know some people are turning to poetry and literature to help them cope during the pandemic, and social. So, as I mentioned before, connecting to that person who, reminds us of some positive emotions, and just generally reaching out to other people so that we know that while we might be distanced, we are not actually alone. So the first question of our little assessment is, what is a self-care practice that you did in the past that really worked for you, but that you no longer do? And I bet all of us have at least one thing. So once you think of that thing that you no longer do, ask yourself, why did you stop? Were you going running and then you stopped because it was winter and it got too cold out? Or you were practicing, you had a mindfulness practice in the morning, and then it just got to be too much with the busy bustle of getting kids off to school, and so you let that kind of slide. Then I want you to think about, what is the self-care practice you can do or that you are doing in the present that works well for you? And I bet, again, that there's something each of us has, even if it's just as little as like, I'm looking out the window and noticing my neighbor's beautiful flowers. What's one thing that's helping you take care of yourself right now during the pandemic? Do you think that you'll continue it? Is this something that you think you'll continue tomorrow, and the day after that? Is it something that you'll continue after the pandemic? If so, why? If not, why not? And really, what could interfere with you continuing it? Expecting, oh, well, I think I'll probably, have to start getting the kids ready for school again, and there will go that mindfulness practice, right? Just think through what could get in the way of you continuing that thing that's allowing you to care for yourself, that's so critical for your survival. And then I want you to think about one self-care practice that you would like to try or commit to in the future. And this can be something that's, that self-care practice that you had before that you set aside, or maybe it's something new. Or maybe you just want to commit to continuing the one self-care practice that you are doing now. And ask yourself why you haven't tried that thing, if it's a new thing, or why you haven't really committed to it yet. What's standing in the way? And then ask yourself, okay, what needs to happen for you to make that commitment? And is that a commitment that you can make? And if all of that sort of felt like overwhelming and you're like, no, Corianna, I don't have anything that I'm doing right now. Nothing feels like it's really working for me and I don't know where to start. I have 6 suggestions for educators and people who work with kids. The first one is connecting with others. So reaching out, whether it's to colleagues or, your high school best friend who you haven't talked to, but you've been meaning to reach out to him for so long. Whoever it is, family members, social connection is really important. The second one is to allow ourselves to rely on healthy rituals and routines. They give us a sense of certainty and a sense of kind of being able to know what we're expecting from the future. And the research literature suggests that when we have that sense of some certainty in the future, we know a little bit about what's coming next. That can really help reduce anxiety. It's also really important to remember your values. So I imagine that, when you decided to work with kids or become a teacher, a counselor, work in a school, there were some values at the core of why you were doing that. And give yourself some time during this pandemic to really remember what those things are and why you do what you do. I think it's also really important for all of us to put on blinders right now. It can be really easy with social media and even all the Zoom calls to compare ourselves to other people. And during the pandemic, each of us are going to have our own unique version of what balance is. And so your balance is not going to be the same as your sister's balance, your colleague's balance, maybe even your partner's balance. But the important thing is that we each allow ourselves to just find what's right for us. What is our own version of balance? And let that be okay. I think all the comparison can be really exhausting and detrimental, especially right now. We can also think about practicing self-awareness. So self-awareness or mindfulness is a practice of observing ourselves as an outsider, paying attention to our thoughts and our feelings in the present moment without judgment. Some people like to do this by using their 5 senses. Other people I know right now are using a lot of apps. A lot of those apps are free to download. And I believe that COVID Coach has some resources around mindfulness as well. And mindfulness can be a really easy and small but powerful way to begin to practice self-care. And finally, it's really important to laugh. Laughing gives us a break. It reminds us that there are things to be grateful for. And gratitude actually is a really important self-care practice that we can add on to this list if I were to make it 7 things. But laughing gives us a chance to engage differently. It sends some different signals in our brains, and it's a good reminder. So, tell yourself a joke, ask a kid to tell you a joke, watch a funny movie. All of those are good ways to laugh. So as we wrap up, I just want to let you all know that the Nest Foundation, Nishima and her colleagues have assembled a really beautiful list of resources. Here's the URL. If you have special requests, you can reach out to Nishima directly. There are resources at both the national and local levels, depending on where you are. As I mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, please do take a moment to fill out the post-Zoom survey. It'll give you an opportunity to make suggestions and requests for future workshops, and it's only 6 questions long, so it can take you less than a minute. Thank you.
Thank you, Corianna. I just populated the chat box with some of the resources that Corianna was talking about and mentioned during our conversation today. If you go to the resources page that's linked at the top, you'll be able to find many more. I do want to invite any questions that you may have. We've got a couple of minutes, or if you have any resources that you'd like to share with your fellow counselors and educators, we welcome those. You can use the chat box to share these, and I'll kind of say them out loud. Let's see, is the idea of sharing mandated reporters new? Someone's asking.
Is your question is the idea of sharing, of letting parents know that you're making a report, is that new? Yeah, so no, I think that it varies though, district by district, and sometimes I think across disciplines. I'm trained as a counseling psychologist, and we always let parents know that we're making a report. I know that some school districts and administrations actually discourage that transparency. So I think it really varies, which is why it's worth mentioning.
If I'm doing this correctly, you should hopefully also be able to speak by unmuting yourselves. Sometimes it's just nicer to have a conversation. Brandy just shared a great resource app called FitOn, F-I-T-O-N, for exercise and self-care. Thank you so much, Brandy. I know that I am trying to exercise to balance out all the bread that are coming my way. So I do want to be mindful of the time. Okay, we have a question about, do we have K-2 resources to encourage kids' language to disclose? We do have, and the resource page that you have just, we've just linked to has some resources there. Nest's primary resources currently focus on grades 3 through 5, and then at the high school level, but we will actually add an elementary section to the resources page. So even if it's an R material, you're able to find some quality material. So when I send a link with the webinar recording and the PowerPoint, I will also include a link to that resources page with some updates.
And a nice way to start kind of thinking about that is, you know, when we think about personal space and our bodies, and, you know, learning the doctor's names for body parts is a really important way to begin to give kids the tools to kind of make disclosures. I think using terms like okay and not okay touch is really important. We don't want to tell kids that there are good touches and bad touches, because that can get really confusing. So I think that there are definitely some resources, and I'm happy if any of you have specific questions, please, you know, feel free to reach out to Nishima and she can send you my way. I'm happy to talk about that more.
We have reached the end of our hour together. Thank you all so much for participating. We appreciate everything that you do as teachers, counselors. We learn from you. So again, we very seriously take your suggestions and take them as ideas as well for future webinars, where we can go a little bit deeply into some of the topics that would help you during this time. You know, we just wish you the best as you continue to navigate the end of the school year into the summer months. I know there's a lot of concern about when kids will be coming back into the school year. So we are actually working on some tools that you'll be able to access, whether it's in the form of a webinar or a forum. We're figuring that out, where we can actually discuss some of those particular issues I know that are on all of your minds about opening schools back up, and how to, you know, really recognize and speak to this collective experience that we've all had. So please keep those coming. Again, if you need to reach me, nashima@nestfoundation.org, that's in the chat box. And you can, our contact info is all over our site as well. And we appreciate you very much. Thank you. And thank you, Corianna, for your expert view today.
Thank you.